James Madison, Federalist No. 10. To the people of the state of New York. Among the many advantages promised by a well-designed union, none deserves closer examination than its power to break up and control the violence of faction. No one who supports popular government is more alarmed than when he sees its tendency toward this dangerous weakness. Instability, injustice, and chaos in public decision-making have been the fatal diseases that have killed popular governments everywhere. They remain the favorite talking points of liberty's enemies, who use them to make their most persuasive attacks. The improvements that American constitutions have made on earlier democratic models, both ancient and modern, certainly deserve admiration. But it would be unwarranted bias to claim that these improvements have eliminated the danger as completely as we hoped and expected. We hear complaints everywhere from our most thoughtful and principled citizens that our governments are too unstable, that the public good gets ignored in the battles between rival parties, and that decisions are too often made not by the rules of justice or respect for minority rights, but by the raw power of a self-interested and domineering majority. However much we might wish these complaints were baseless, the facts won't let us deny that they contain some truth. A fair review of our situation will show that some of our problems have been wrongly blamed on how our governments operate, but it will also show that other factors alone can explain many of our worst troubles, particularly the widespread and growing distrust of public commitments and alarm about private rights that echoes from one end of the continent to the other. These must be mainly, if not entirely, the result of the inconsistency and injustice that the factious spirit has brought into our public affairs. By a faction, I mean a group of citizens, whether a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and driven by some shared impulse of passion or interest that works against the rights of other citizens or against the lasting and collective interests of the community. There are two ways to cure the problem caused by faction: either remove its causes or control its effects. There are two ways to remove the causes of faction: destroy the liberty that allows it to exist, or give every citizen identical opinions, identical passions, and identical interests. The first remedy is worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what oxygen is to fire, the fuel without which it dies instantly. But it would be no less foolish to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it feeds faction, than it would be to wish for the elimination of oxygen, which is essential to animal life, because it allows fire to burn destructively. The second solution is as impractical as the first would be unwise. As long as human reasoning remains imperfect, and as long as people are free to exercise it, different opinions will form. As long as the connection exists between people's reasoning and their self-interest, their opinions and their passion will influence each other reciprocally, and opinions will become objects to which passions attach themselves. The diversity in people's abilities, from which property rights originate, is an equally insurmountable obstacle to uniformity of interests. Protecting these different abilities is government's first job. From the protection of different and unequal abilities to acquire property, people naturally come to possess different degrees and kinds of property, and from the influence of these different holdings on the sentiments and perspectives of their owners comes a division of society into different interests and parties. The hidden causes of faction are sewn into human nature itself. We see them spring into varying degrees of activity depending on the circumstances of civil society. Passionate commitment to different opinions about religion, about government, and many other issues both theoretical and practical. Attachment to different leaders competing ambitiously for power and prominence. Or attachment to other figures whose fortune has stirred human passions. All these have divided humanity into parties. inflamed them with mutual hostility, and made them far more inclined to harass and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is humanity's tendency to fall into mutual hostilities that where no real reason exists, the most trivial and absurd distinctions have been enough to spark hostile passions and violent conflicts. But the most common and lasting source of action has been the unequal distribution of property. Those who own property and those who don't have always formed distinct interests in society. Creditors and debtors fall into a similar division. Agricultural interest, manufacturing interest, commercial interest, financial interest, and many smaller interests necessarily develop in civilized nations and divide them into different classes driven by different sentiments and perspectives. Managing these various and competing interests is the main job of modern legislation, and it brings the spirit of party and faction into the necessary and ordinary operations of government. No one is allowed to judge their own case, because their interest would certainly bias their judgment and probably corrupt their integrity. For equal, indeed for even stronger reasons, a group of people is unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important legislative acts but exactly that? Judicial decisions not about individual rights but about the rights of larger groups of citizens. And what are legislators from different constituencies but advocates and parties to the cause they decide? Is a law proposed about private debts? It's a question where creditors are parties on one side and debtors on the other. Justice should hold the balance between them. Yet, the parties must be judges themselves, and the largest party, in other words, the most powerful faction, will inevitably prevail. Should domestic manufacturing be encouraged, and to what degree, through restrictions on foreign goods? These questions would be decided differently by agricultural and manufacturing interests, and probably by neither with sole regard to justice and the public good. Distributing taxes among different types of property seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet, perhaps no legislative act offers great opportunity and temptation for a dominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every dollar they shift onto the minority is a dollar saved for their own pockets. It's pointless to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to balance these competing interests and make them all serve the public good. Enlightened statesmen won't always be in charge, and in many cases such balancing can't be achieved at all without considering indirect and long-term factors that will rarely outweigh the immediate interest one party finds in ignoring the rights of another or the good of the whole. The conclusion we must reach is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief can only be found in controlling its effects. If a faction is less than a majority, relief comes through the republican principle which lets the majority defeat its harmful plans through regular voting. A minority faction may obstruct the government, it may shake up society, but it can't carry out in disguise its violence under constitutional forms. When a majority becomes a faction, however, popular government enables it to sacrifice both the public good and the rights of other citizens to its ruling passion or interest. To protect the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, while still preserving the spirit and form of popular government. How can this objective be achieved? Clearly by one of only two means. Either we must prevent a majority from sharing the same passion or interest at the same time, or the majority, despite having such shared passion or interest, must be unable, because of their numbers and geographic spread, to coordinate and carry out schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity coincide, we know well that neither moral nor religious principles can be relied on as adequate restraints. They don't adequately restrain the injustices and violence of individuals, and they lose effectiveness in proportion to the number acting together. That is, they weaken precisely when their strength becomes most needed. From this perspective, we conclude that pure democracy, by which I mean a society of a small number of citizens who assemble and govern in person, offers no cure for the problems of faction. A shared passion or interest will almost always grip a majority of the whole. Communication and coordination flow naturally from the form of government itself, and nothing checks the incentives to sacrifice a weaker party or unpopular individual. This is why such democracies have always been scenes of turbulence and conflict, have always proven incompatible with personal security or property rights, and have generally lived short lives that ended violently. Academic theorists who have championed this kind of government have mistakenly assumed that by making people perfectly equal in their political rights, they would simultaneously become perfectly equal and alike in their property, opinions, and passions. A republic, by which I mean a government based on representation, opens a different prospect and promises the cure we are seeking. Let's examine how it differs from pure democracy, and we will understand both the nature of the cure and the effectiveness it gains from the union. The two great differences between a democracy and a republic are: first, in a republic the government is delegated to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Second, a republic can extend over a great number of citizens and a larger territory. The first difference has this effect. On one hand, it refines and broadens public view by filtering them through a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best identify their country's true interest, and whose patriotism commitment to justice will least likely sacrifice it to temporary and narrow concerns. Under such a system, the public voice expressed through representatives may align better with the public good than if expressed by the people themselves assembled for that purpose. On the other hand, the opposite effect may occur. People of factious temperament, narrow prejudices, or corrupt designs may obtain votes through scheming, bribery, or other means, and then betray the people's interest. The question becomes: do small or large republics better favor the election of proper guardians of public welfare? The answer clearly favors larger republics for two obvious reasons. First, note that however small the republic, representatives must reach a certain number to guard against the scheming of a few, and however large a republic, they must be limited to a certain number to avoid the confusion of a multitude. Therefore, the number of representatives who won't be proportional to the population in the two cases, it will be proportionally larger in the small republic. If the proportion of qualified candidates is no lower in the larger republic than in the small one, the larger republic will offer more options and thus a greater chance of a good choice. Second, each representative in a large republic will be chosen by more citizens than in a small republic, making it harder for unworthy candidates to successfully practice the corrupt tactics by which elections are too often won. With more voters exercising freer choice, votes will more likely to go to people with genuine merit and a well-established, widely respected character. We must acknowledge that in this, as in most cases, there is a middle ground, with problems on both extremes. Expand the voter base too much, and representatives become too unfamiliar with local circumstances and smaller interests. Shrink it too much, and representatives become too attached to these local matters and too limited to understand and pursue great national objectives. The federal constitution strikes a good balance here. Great collective interests go to the national legislature, local and particular ones to state legislatures. The other key difference is the great number of citizens and larger territory that can fall within a republic compared to a democracy. This circumstance is what mainly makes dangerous factious combinations less threatening in the former than the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer distinct parties and interests it probably contains. The fewer distinct parties and interests, the more often a majority will belong to the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals in a majority and the smaller the area they occupy, the more easily they can coordinate and execute their oppressive plans. Expand the sphere and you encompass a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less likely that a majority will share a motive to violate other citizens' rights. Or, if such a shared motive exists, it becomes harder for all who feel it to recognize their collective strength and act together. Beyond other obstacles, note that where there's awareness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always inhibited by distrust. increasingly so as the number whose cooperation is required grows larger. It's clear then that the same advantage a republic has over a democracy in controlling factions' effects is enjoyed by a larger republic over a small one, and by the union over the individual states composing it. Thus the advantage lie in representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous principles make them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice. No one will deny that union representatives will most likely possess these essential qualities. Does it lie in the greater security provided by a greater variety of parties, reducing the chance that any one party can outnumber and oppress the rest? The increased variety of parties within the Union equally increases the security. Does it lie in the greater obstacles to the coordination and achievement of an unjust and self-interest majority's hidden agenda? Here again, the Union's size gives it the clearest advantage. Factious leaders may ignite a flame within their own states, but will be unable to spread a general fire through other states. A religious sect may become a political faction in one party of the country, but the variety of sects scattered across the whole territory protects the national government from any danger from that source. A craze for paper money, for debt cancellation, for equal redistribution of property, or for any other reckless or destructive project will be less likely to sweep through the entire Union than through one particular state, just as such a disease is more likely to infect a particular county or district than an entire state. In the size and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we find a republican remedy for the diseases most common to republican government, and in proportion to the pleasure and pride we take in being republicans should be our enthusiasm for nurturing the spirit and supporting the principles